Hello, today we are going to talk about herpes or herpes simplex virus, HSV, and chances are you already have it. I have HSV-1. I get cold sores. My entire life I thought that a cold sore was just a cold sore because that's what it is called by a lot of people. I've had cold sores for as long as I can remember, and I actually didn't realize that oral herpes or cold sores were herpes until I had already transmitted it to my then boyfriend in high school's genitals. That was a fun time. That was a really interesting learning experience for me. Not only was I shocked that this thing I thought was just like, oh, it's like when you get a cold. You get a cold sore. The cold sore is an outbreak that essentially happens when your immune system is feeling weaker, compromised in some situation, you're under stress, whatever. That is when the sore breaks out. But you constantly have the HSV virus living in your system. Ooh, sounds so scary, but it's actually not. The reason I say that most of us have it is because literally 50 to 80% of Americans, at least, have either HSV-1 or HSV-2. HSV type 1 does tend to be the type of HSV that you receive to get cold sores, whereas HSV type 2 is generally the type that is expressed genitally. However, you can have either type in either location or both in both locations, although that is exceedingly rare. Type 1 tends to look like the single sores, and then type 2 is kind of like the more cauliflower looking one. Even though you really can't know for sure which type of sore you have unless you bring your sore to a doctor and they swab it and test it, generally, visually, that is what they look like. Like I said, herpes tends to infect the oral region and the genital region, but it can also affect other parts of the body. One thing you really have to watch out for if you do have a herpes infection is touching a sore and then touching your eye. You wouldn't want to transmit the infection to your eye. If you have herpes in your eyes, it can cause blindness, but that is not to alarm you because that is not something that is very common, and you would have to literally touch a sore and then touch your eye. It can also cause your brain to have something called encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain, but that is a very, very rare thing that happens from a herpes infection. I bring up these two situations not to scare you, but to say that with the exception of those two versions of a herpes infection, it is really just a cosmetic sore. Having an open sore does give you a direct access to the bloodstream, so it is easier to transmit other viral infections. But if you have a sore and an outbreak, you should really be, taking a break from sexual activity. If you're not having unprotected sex, or exposing your sore to other people's blood or sexual fluids, this is really not something to worry about. The vast majority of people who have an HSV infection are asymptomatic, and the only way that you would be able to tell that you have herpes if you aren't having an outbreak is through a blood test, which is also why they don't automatically offer you an HSV blood test when you get a physical done, because just about everybody has it. Doing blood tests for HSV, it's expensive. I am so continuously shocked by people's reactions to herpes, especially given that it's not life-threatening and so many of us fucking have it. Essentially, the herpes virus is always virally shedding. What that means is that you can always transmit herpes to somebody else. You don't need a sore to do it, although the sores make it really easy to transmit the virus. So for that reason, people who have herpes and don't have sores and therefore think they don't have herpes are actually constantly shedding that virus from their system, and it is in fact transmittable. They just don't know about it. So for that reason, in many ways, it is safer to have sex with somebody who has genital outbreaks of HSV, takes their medication, and knows how to manage their symptoms. You're much safer off with a person like that than somebody who has no idea whether they have the virus or not. Herpes is spread from skin-to-skin contact through mucous membranes. The reason herpes likes the mouth and genitals is that those are thinner mucous membrane tissues that just are easier for the sore to express themselves through. So when it comes to safer sex with a herpes infection, you can use condoms and dental dams, and those definitely protect a very specific surface area. However, you can still transmit it. You can really transmit just about all STIs if you're using condoms and dental dams perfectly, simply because most STIs are spread through skin-to-skin contact and bacteria getting into other mucous membranes, and you are, of course, reducing your chances greatly from transmitting or receiving these infections. But it is not the kind of thing where you're just like fully immune to it. So somebody who has a herpes infection and is like, how did I get this? I've been so safe my entire life. There's so many ways to get it, whether it's from virally shedding. Like, these are things that happen. And that is why so many people have herpes. I really just think of them as annoying zits that take a little bit longer to go away. I just really find it amazing that people make such a big deal about herpes when there are much more scary STIs like HPV, which can actually lead to cancer. But we still freak out more about HSV because there's a cosmetic sore associated with it. There are actually types of HPV that give you sores, the wart variety of HPV. The HPV strains that give you warts tend to not be the same strains that are cancer causing. It's really strange because if HSV didn't have sores, there would be very little concern otherwise. People are really just afraid of getting sores. But I think it just goes to show how much as a culture we place an emphasis upon beauty and flawlessness as opposed to actual considerations of our health. I would much rather have genital HSV than HPV that is cancer causing. But our brains don't think that way. Having genital HSV definitely is the kind of thing where you are ideally going to disclose this to a partner. It's really easy to do. I always recommend kind of creating an elevator pitch of your sexual health history, whether you have herpes or not, so that you can have sudden hot sex and quickly negotiate your boundaries and let a partner know what you do and don't have so that you can give them the information they need to make a decision more quickly. As far as my oral HSV infection goes, my elevator pitch might sound something like, hey, I was tested recently. I don't have any STIs, but I do get HSV1 orally from time to time. I know what it feels like when I'm getting an outbreak. I get them every few years. I don't have any symptoms right now. Do what you will with that information, but just wanted you to know I have oral herpes. The average person is going to be like, cool, I have herpes too. Or they're going to be like, cool, thanks for letting me know. Like, let me know if you feel like you're going to have an outbreak. Or maybe they'll say, cool, like, let's not have oral sex right now. I'll think about this. All of those things are very typical responses, but we aren't taught to communicate this way to partners. So we're always just like, wait a minute, like, what you want me to do what? If somebody had a genital herpes outbreak and wasn't disclosing that, we're like trained as a society to be like, oh my god, that's so unethical. And like, yes, it is. You should be disclosing things like that to people, but we don't think about that when it comes to oral herpes. And it's so interesting how the same exact bug has a completely different social connotation when it hits below the belt. Because remember, our mouths are sex organs in the sense that they can perform sex acts. It is good to give a disclosure if you have cold sores or any type of oral infection of HSV1, and you can use my elevator pitch to model your elevator pitch after it, but I really just want you to know that it seems like a really high stakes thing, and because we aren't in a culture where we're in the habit of disclosures like this, like, yes, you're gonna get people who look at you funny and are like, that was very direct, that is very strange, but let me think about this, I appreciate your honesty. I mean, honestly, that's the reaction I get from most people when I am that direct about it. And I think it also challenges people's notions of like transparency, because we also aren't taught to disclose HPV. I think that's because many of us don't know we have HPV, but it's again one of those infections that infects such a wide range of people that it is kind of assumed if you are intimate with somebody, chances are that you are being exposed to HPV and HSV. If you have had more than one sex partner, chances are that you've been exposed to HSV and HPV. And that is just a statistic that you need to wrap your mind around in order to stop perceiving people who do have these STIs as like alien monsters who have these atrocities of warts, because honestly, it's most people you know. Whenever I hear somebody making a herpes joke, it really just makes them look bad, in my opinion. It makes total sense why it instills fear in people. After all, I have been terrified of various STIs throughout my lifetime, and I know for me, that feeling came from a place of like, how will anybody love me? I'm already such a difficult person to deal with, and if I have an incurable STI like herpes, who will love me? The truth is that many people will love you. We aren't in the habit of talking to our peers about this by any means, but if we just have a conversation with 1, 2, 3 people close to us, I think that you're going to find that not only does somebody have herpes, but they have a lot of thoughts that they haven't felt comfortable sharing with anybody else until you brought it to their attention. Herpes is just another organism trying to survive in this fucked up world, and it is nothing personal if it chooses you. Everybody has something about their health, their body, their mind. We all have things that set us apart and make us different, things we feel insecure about, things we feel vulnerable about. And yes, herpes is one of those things. So let's say that you just got a brand new herpes infection. Hooray! This is going to be the worst of it. You are going to probably feel a little cruddy, regardless of the information you know about HSV. It's a bummer. They're painful sores. You gotta wait a little while for them to go away. Sometimes it temporarily takes you out of action. That part sucks. That is valid. It's gonna be a steep learning curve though. The more you get used to talking about it with other people and managing your symptoms, I think you'll find as more time passes that it just gets easier. My best advice to you is to read up on all the information regarding herpes, because just knowing the information is going to help a lot. So just watching this video, a great start. But also you can practice talking about it in private to your mirror. You can talk about it with a friend who you trust, who you maybe aren't sexual and intimate with, but you can just model role play how that conversation goes with a new partner or an existing partner. It is only going to get easier from here on out, and that is my promise to you. Let's say you have an oral HSV infection and you are like out dancing somewhere and randomly make out with somebody. Have you infected them? Did you just do something really bad by not disclosing your HSV status to them? If you don't have a cold sore that's in the middle of an outbreak, then chances are that like A, everything's gonna be okay, and B, this person probably already has the bug and doesn't even know it, or has cold sores themselves and didn't disclose it to you. It's a really interesting ethical question, and I'm not here trying to say that it is okay to just lie to people about your HSV status. In an ideal world, we should be talking about these things. Another really interesting thing about herpes is that if you have HSV1 orally and you come into contact with somebody that has HSV1 genitally, then yes, there is a chance you could also get that genitally. However, you actually have a reduced risk of beginning to acquire a genital infection if you already have an oral infection. The body actually tends to keep the infection expressing itself in the initial site of infection. So that doesn't mean that it's impossible, but you have lower chances of getting the same type of HSV in a different location. Sometimes people get one outbreak genitally if they come into contact with it with HSV1 and have it orally, but then the infection tends to just remain orally from there on out. But again, that's not true for everybody. It is also slightly more difficult to get HSV2 if you already have HSV1, and vice versa. If you have one type already, it just reduces your chances of getting the second type because your body is already accustomed to the other type. The virus looks very similar, and as I said earlier, you can have both types in both or either location, but you are reducing your chances when you have one type. Maybe that's reassuring, or maybe that's just stressful to hear, but I think that's a really important piece of information that often gets overlooked. Going back to my high school boyfriend that I transmitted HSV to him genitally, he never got another outbreak after that. And that might have been because he already had HSV1 in his system and was not expressing symptoms, and it was just that stray contact with my cold sore that elicited the reaction and caused there to be a cold sore. But maybe he just never had an outbreak again because that was the way his body worked. A lot of people with HSV infections get an initial reaction and don't have sores after the initial reaction, or their initial reaction is the most intense outbreak, and then the subsequent outbreaks tend to be less severe. So folks with new infections, keep in mind that the first outbreak does tend to be the worst. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm making lots of generalizations here when it comes to risk reduction. I'm really just trying to give you this information because it's not readily available out there. You can actually find this information if you do a really deep dive on herpes, but there's also a lot of scary stuff if you go out there. Just like when you Google any medical condition, you're going to find cancer immediately. The important thing for you to remember, whether you do have herpes or you don't, is that there are much scarier things out there in the world. This is actually a really manageable bug that is a pain in the ass, but it's manageable. And I have dated people who have genital herpes infections with type 2, with type 1, and I have yet to have a genital outbreak. That doesn't mean that it isn't possible, but it doesn't mean that you should completely write somebody off who you really have strong feelings for otherwise. The first time I dated somebody with a genital outbreak of HSV, I was definitely cautious. I was like, I don't know, I really have to think about this before we have sex. And I thought about it, and they really weren't pushy. They were just like, cool, I understand. Let me know how it sounds to you. And also, like, my partners always told me about their infections right out of the gate. And, you know, these were all people with genital outbreaks because, again, like, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who's in the habit of disclosing their oral outbreak because that is just not the social norm, right? But having them disclose it right off the bat to me, if anything, just made me like them more. And I thought about it a lot, and I remember doing research on herpes statistics, and when I realized, like, okay, I've slept with all these people in my past, and chances are that I have encountered herpes before, why would I not be intimate with somebody that I have really strong feelings for, who knows they have herpes and is controlling and managing their infection? So it kind of ended up being a no-brainer to me when I thought about all the information, and I realized my emotional reaction was valid, but also I felt really safe and secure with this person, and I knew that even if I were to get an HSV infection genitally, that it would be worth it in the long run because I would be true to my heart. So in my opinion, it is not those of us with warts and sores that are the monstrous ones. It is the people who are really nasty and mean and make fun of people who do. They can conquer that feeling of discomfort and vulnerability by cracking a joke at it, but it's generally at the expense of others. So I think that is truly the monstrosity in the herpes world. Not the people with the infection, but the people who are shaming people for having this cosmetic sore that, you know, they're aware of. I hope this video has helped you think about herpes in a new way. I know that this is a very research-heavy subject, and while I have done my research, I highly encourage you to check out more information about herpes on websites like Scarletine. Those are really awesome, trustworthy websites. And I'm also going to link to other articles I have written about my experience with HSV.